So I just started working on a PowerPoint for this class because your review was pretty thorough and you guys did a fabulous job answering everything in the review. So I was just starting to put one together that maybe had some information in it. So first of all, our test is not until Friday. We have the last day. You guys are doing pictures in the afternoons, Wednesday and Thursday. And then Friday, we have the 8:30 time slot. And this is what it looks like. It's 124 questions. It'll be an Illuminate ad like we've been doing all along. Of the test, 6 are true false. Pretty easy. 79 are multiple choice, so the majority will be multiple choice. 14 are going to be in the form of matching, and there's 3 sets of matching, so you can prepare yourself for this. 1, you have the systems, and we've only studied 3 systems, so how hard can it be? So you'll just have nervous, muscular, and skeletal. On your review sheet, you had a table of directional turns and a table of muscle actions. So one of the matchings has to do with those terms, like proximal, distal, abduction, adduction. And then the third matching has to do with brain functions. So like the cerebellum, equilibrium, frontal lobe, thinking, that sort of thing. And then you've done the 3 self-checks on labeling, so you already know which bones or muscles you will see. You'll have a skeleton, front and back. You'll have a skull, and you'll have a muscle mass, front and back. And the labeling is the last part of the test. If you feel comfortable jumping around, you might jump all the way to the back. This just came up last hour. Jump to the end and do the labeling first, and then you would have pretty much a reference guide that you could refer to in questions that use descriptive, like if they're describing the thigh, and then you could look at the thigh. I don't know, I thought that might be helpful. In the Google world, this is what you guys already have. So the review packet you guys did, and I read through most of that. Here and there I would skim, but most of it I read through, and you guys are right on. If you weren't right on, I made comments or suggestions. You have Quizlets, but for the whole semester, these are by chapter. So if you felt like you just had one specific topic you wanted to quiz yourself on, or there's also a Cumulative Quizlet that covers the whole chapter or the whole semester. And this is off of the original review guide. I had slimmed yours down just a little bit. And then also you have 5 different videos or not videos, slideshows of Q&A practice. So what questions might look like from that particular chapter. And you want to do it in the view form, otherwise you're going to miss the opportunity to think because it's going to give you a question and answer right away. All right, when I was going through the review sheets, I thought I would point out some common mistakes. So 2 questions commonly missed. Which bones support most of the weight of the body? And that would be the lumbar. And I know if you looked this question up, you might have gotten calcaneus, you might have gotten femur. It depends on the reference words they're using. So support versus bears the weight, for example, if it's referring to the upper body or lower body. So I know you might have gotten different answers. What I'm looking for on the test is going to be lumbar. How many vertebrae are in the adult skeleton? A lot of you put 33. I'm looking for 26. So in the baby you have, or in the fetus, you have 5 sacrum and 4 coccygeal. But they fuse into 1 sacrum and 1 coccygeal. And so that's how we get 26 instead of 33. Other common, like maybe fine-tuning points. A lot of us, when I asked about yellow marrow, you identified fat. And yes, fat is probably the majority of that yellow marrow, but you will also find nerves and blood cells. So in the next chapter, we're going to talk about stem cells for blood, and they are found in the yellow marrow, and they form every type of blood cell that you will have. So there's lots of different blood cells in various stages of development in the yellow marrow as well. So that's just a fine-tuning piece. Another fine-tuning piece had to do with distal and proximal. A lot of people said nearer or farther from. Nearer or farther from what? I'm assuming you know, but you did not tell me necessarily. Make sure you're referring to the attachment of the body. Okay? Nearer the attachment and further the attachment. Nearer proximal, further distal. So I'm assuming that you guys probably had that in mind when you said that, but just making sure we're on the same track. Okay, so I might add a little bit more to that and then post it later. That's just the particulars of the test. Like I said, your review sheets look pretty well spot on. So you might have your review sheet open as well, so that you could highlight asterisk or whatever. I'm going to point out the things that you can ignore for the time being and how you should think about each of the topics, okay? So anatomical position, obviously you're going to get a multiple choice question just describing standing upright, hands forward, feet forward. Under the sections, you don't need to worry about frontal. The only two that show up on the test are sagittal and transverse. And they're both used as an example. So you're not defining them. It'd be like, what type of cut is used to cut the brain into right and left halves? Or what type of cut is used to cut the brain into top and bottoms or inferior superior? Okay, so recognize example. For the directional terms, you can see the ones that didn't make the cuts. The ones that are highlighted are the ones that are on the test, and in red is how I asked you about them. Ones that are definition, that's going to be your matching, right? So just knowing that posterior is the back side and lateral is to the side. When it says reference, the word is used in a question, and the question isn't about the word posterior. It would be using posterior to guide you. So like which muscle is found on the posterior thigh, or which muscle is found on the anterior thigh. You have to know what posterior means to answer that question, right? So that's what I mean by reference. So posterior used in a question, lateral used in a question. Example, what is found lateral to the belly button? The hip, okay? So these are all used in reference points pretty much. Okay, the next section, we don't have any landmarks, so I don't think I made them on your review. I made your review shorter. The three systems, just to make sure that we think the same. With skeletal, I'm referring to storing minerals and appendages and support and protection. Some of you would write movement. I associate movement with muscles. Okay, nerves responding to stimuli, muscles locate locomotion or movement, and heat production. So not everybody identifies heat production. For the levels of organization, the only one you will need on the test is the organ system. So recognize an example of an organ system like urinary system, immune system, cardiovascular system. The negative positive feedbacks, recognizing an example. So negative feedback is one that corrects a situation. So you're too hot, you sweat, you cool. You're too cold, you shiver, you warm, right? The only two positive feedbacks we talked about were with childbirth or pregnancy and with blood clotting. So in this case, the stimulus continues, which continues the response, which continues the stimulus. So it accelerates. Under the labelings, where it says diagram, that means you're labeling it on a diagram, and you already got that list. I believe I cut off the tibia articulates with. It articulates with the talus, but I think I That one didn't make the cut. If it's in green, this is last year's review. The green was on last year's test, but not this year's test. Clavicle, so in addition to the diagram, also know what it connects with. So you know the clavicle articulates with the sternum in the front and the scapula to the side. Description means you're going to see it in a multiple choice question, not a labeling question. So the lowest portion or most inferior portion of the sternum is the xiphoid. And then floating description, so rather than diagramming, this would be like they have no anterior connection. Metacarpals also know that it's the palm of your hand. Pectoral girdle includes, you guys all had that, scapula and clavicle. I cut off that question. Structure of bone, all of you had epiphysis and hyaline cartilage just fine. Epiphysis being the end of the bone, hyaline cartilage covering that end, covering the epiphysis, covering the articular surface. So review sheets looked great there. Bunch of stuff you can skip or it was already cut off your test. Under bone tissue, the yellow marrow I already addressed, also contains blood cells. Osteoblasts, you guys all had that, forms new bone cells in bone tissue. Vitamin D increases calcium uptake. Joints are also known as articulations. Most of us had that, a few of us maybe not. So make sure you know joints also articulations. The three functional joint classifications, again, most of us had this, a couple of us gave me structural. So functional, synarthroses, amphiarthroses, diarthroses, with the least being synarthrotic and the most being the diarthrotic and more specifically the synovial joint. So a lot of people gave me ball and socket for that. I think I'm looking for synovial. Ball and socket is an example. Sutures are found in the skull and they do not move. Most of us have that. A couple of us didn't. Okay, description. These probably you're going to find in that matching piece. Extend, referring to angle at a joint, right? Flexion decreases in angle. Extension increases in angle. Adduction adds to the midline. Supination, palm up. Inversion, the palms of the feet medial. Soles of the feet. Miscellaneous, I went through these. Everybody had hyoid bone, not attached. Everybody had femur as the strongest bone. Everybody had 12 pairs of ribs. So good job on that. Ligaments hold bones to bones. Some of us gave us descriptions rather than function. So ligaments hold bones to bones. Skipping ahead, sliding filament theory. This was one of the common questions that came up in yesterday's thread. You need to know the overall concept. So you don't have to tell me calcium is released from sarcoplasmic reticulum, binds to troponin, falls off. You just need to be able to tell me that actin slides past myosin. The thin slides past the thick. When they do so, the Z lines come together. Which neurotransmitter is involved is acetylcholine. So very minimal information you need. And that's going to be repeated down here. Know that myosin is the thick, it doesn't move. Actin is the thin, it slides, it moves. It is the sliding component. The synapse is the gap between two cells. The Z lines come closer together. Actin slides past myosin. So that's the extent you need on that sliding filament theory. Under skeletal muscles, I gave you the diagram, but also remember you need to know what those muscles do or be able to describe them. So I'll go through which ones you need. Remember that action is always produced by pulling, never pushing. So if it moves the forearm, it inserts on the forearm, right? The distal moves towards the proximal. Insertion is on the immovable bone, on the movable bone. Usually that's the distal attachment. There was some question on insertion and origin in yesterday's thread. So just knowing that it's on the movable bone, so if it says it inserts on the thigh, you know the thigh moves, okay? Prime mover, the one mainly responsible. So the prime mover of flexing the forearm would be the bicep. The synergist, brachioradialis, assists in the movement. The antagonist is the tricep brachii. It extends while the bicep flexes. So they provide opposite actions, prime mover and antagonist. Synergist provides the same action. The movable bone contains the insertion, and the origin is more like an anchor. It's the immovable bone. And again, where it says diagram, that's labeling. You already had that list. But in addition to that, location would be a description, and function would be what it does. So rectus abdominis would be like the anterior surface of the abdomen. The function would be to bend the trunk in several planes. Rectus femoris would be on the anterior surface of the thigh, and I'll reference it as the quadriceps in the multiple choice question. Function would be to extend the lower leg with great force. Biceps femoris, also know its common name is the hamstring. It's located on the posterior of the thigh. That might be its description as well. So I didn't have you spell all those things out on your review. I just had you do the labeling and then said, also know these things. Last year's review, they had to spell them all out. Biceps brachii, again, in addition to the diagram, it's insertion. So the biceps brachii is flexing the forearm, therefore it's inserting on the forearm, right? The radius in particular. Deltoid, let's see, those are all diagrams, so you already got the list that you need to label. Triceps, you also need to know its function, so extending the forearm. Gastrocnemius points the toe, plantar flexus. It's the muscle most prominent when standing on your toe. Location, the calf muscle, the back of the calf. Again, if it says diagram, it's labeling. Function of gluteus medius would be an abduction of the thigh. So bringing the legs out when you do the jumping jacks, for example. Frontalis is found covering the frontal bone. Diagram is labeling. You won't have to label a neuron. I had you label the neuron so that you could recognize which one from a group of words is not a structure of the neuron. So you'll be given a group of words like axon, neuron, dendrite, synapse. Which one of these is not a structural component? So if you wouldn't label it on the diagram, it's not a structural component. The dendrite, so you know these are the receiving extensions, and the axon is the sending extension. So these are long extensions taking impulses away from the cell body toward the synapse. Myelin fatty insulation, description, effect, speeds neural transmission. Neurotransmitters are chemical signals used to communicate between neurons and other cells. Okay, you guys did really well down here on the central nervous system stuff as well, but just make sure that you're using the same word as I'm using. The CNS is the brain and spinal cord, and it's the control center of the cell, integration, and decision making. The cerebrum, description would be like the largest portion of the brain, or the superficial portion of the brain. One of the functions is emotions. So make sure you're associating that with cerebrum. Cerebellum is the second largest. It's located below the occipital lobe. It's responsible for balance and equilibrium. Thalamus, make sure you have relay in your answer. It's a relay center. Hypothalamus, its functions, thirst, hunger. Medulla oblongata, all your vital signs, heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, swallowing. Make sure you have those words. Skipping down, occipital lobe with vision, temporal with hearing. You did the 3 layers of the meninges. The only one you need for the test is the pia. It's the innermost layer. Delicate meninge. The brainstem connects the brain and the spinal cord. Post-central gyrus, that's in your matching. It's the somatic sensory cortex. Cerebral spinal fluid is one of your brain, one of the 3 things we have to protect the brain. So that's important. Protecting the brain, specific function, acts as a shock absorber. Autonomic, those things that we can't consciously control, smooth muscles, glands, organs. Somatic, those things that you can control, like skeletal muscles. The patellar reflex is somatic because it's a skeletal muscle. Autonomic, pupillary reflex, those iris muscles are smooth muscles, so that is an autonomic reflex. Sympathetic versus parasympathetic, you will have sympathetic on the test. So you'll have a multiple choice question. It'll list a bunch of actions. Remember, sympathetic is fight or flight. So you want to pick the one that only has to do with fight or flight, not rest and digest. Most of these are speeding things up. CNS versus PNS. So I said integration. PNS is more monitoring. Then you have a list, know your examples of neurons and neuroglia. Neurons are the ones that are sending signals, transmitting impulses. Action potential, this is one of the things that came up in yesterday's thread. You really just need to know that it's a depolarization of the cell membrane. Sodium rushes in and causes that depolarization. You had a list of neuroglia. I'll come back to that when we get there. General description, these are the protective and supporting cells. Neurotransmitter, I already mentioned. Chemical signals. Sensory neurons, just recognize that as one of your examples of a neuron. You have sensory, motor, associative, otherwise known as interneuron. So I use the word interneuron in that. Motor, you might also use as somatic. So recognize those words go together. The motor division or the somatic division. Schwann cells, you want to know they create myelin in the PNS. The oligodendrocyte is one of your examples of neuroglia. So which of these are neuroglia? Which of these are neurons? Microglia is the cleanup. Neuroglia gets rid of old dead cells. Astrocytes, largest, most numerous, part of the blood-brain barrier. Myelin is that fatty insulation. Speeds nervous transmission. Kind of already said that. Remember, ascending pathways are on the back side, descending of the front side. So ascending is dorsal, descending is anterior or ventral. You'll have a multiple choice questions that scrambles all the components of a reflex arc. So you want to put the 5 in proper order: receptor, sensory, neuron, associative, motor, and effector. Neuromuscular junction, neuro, nerve, muscle, cell, junction, where they come together. And then the sclera, you want to know that it's the white of the eye. You also need to put your tunics in proper order. So sclera being the outermost tunic, choroid middle, and retina innermost. So for those, that's all you need for that. Iris controls the size of the pupil. Fovea centralis description, so you want to know that it's the area of the greatest concentration of cones, greatest visual acuity. Blind spot description, so not where you can't see, but the optic nerve, no worries, the optic nerve exits the eye. The refracted media in proper sequence, again, I saw this, like this is one of the things I tried to pay attention to. We all seem to have it on the review sheet. So cornea, aqueous humor, lens, vitreous humor. You guys got it. Stapes, that is the last of your 3 ossicles of the middle ear. Location, function, presses on that oval window to transmit the vibrations. When describing the process of hearing, you're specifically talking about the cochlea and the hair cells within the cochlea. So the hair cells are pressed by the fluid, and then the signal will be sent. The eustachian tube, the diagonal auditory tube, its job is equalization of air pressure. The pinna, the fleshy part of the ear, its job is to capture and direct sound waves. So what I mean by conditions, cones are bright light and color. Rods are dim light and contrast. And then we didn't have taste or odor, so the only thing we have left is equilibrium, and the only one you need for the test is static equilibrium, which is in the vestibule. It's your position in space with respect to gravity. Okay. So not like content, really here, more just what you want to know about each of the words and what can you spend more time focusing on and what can you like ignore for the time being. Okay, so I tried to hit the things that came up in yesterday's thread. Other than that, is there anything I can expound on, questions I can answer, give you more details?